There are thousands of videos and articles online that tries to give you the secret to cinematic filmmaking, how to make your shots look like Hollywood, how to make them look good, especially for video projects or indie films. And I've never really been super satisfied with the amount of information that's out there. And so what I want to do is I want to run through 20 rules to cinematic filmmaking that I have learned from other people, and that I have personally experienced being in production behind a camera for well over 12 years in the professional video field. I have made 6 short films. I have done countless documentary style videos and countless YouTube videos, both for myself and for clients. I've done so much when it comes to video production all around the country, and I want to share with you all of my thoughts around what makes good cinematic footage and what are the rules to getting the cinematic success you always hope for a project that you are working on. So if you stick with me for these next 20 rules in this video, I can almost guarantee you that if you really let it sink in, if you take notes and you apply this to your cinematic process, you will see success. And you will start having your films or documentaries or YouTube videos or whatever you want to work on to make it look cinematic. You will see that you have grown by knowing this information and putting it into practice. The very first one I would say is have depth in your image depth. So what does that mean? I always say that I want 3 or more layers to my image. So let's take a look at some examples from the movie Napoleon. You have 3 levels of depth when you look at this image. You have the foreground, you have the middle ground, and you have the background. Behind the trees, you see those mountains in the background. This is image depth. You do not want your images to be very dull or shallow or just kind of boring to look at. You want it to feel real and you want there to be depth. And one way you could do that is visualize 3 or more layers and make sure you're capturing that, making sure your camera angles are set up to capture that. Here's another example from Pirates of the Caribbean, a little kind of over the shoulder shot, but really it is just 3 levels deep. You have the Elizabeth character in the foreground. She's a little out of focus, where the focus is Jack Sparrow on the middle ground. And then you have the background, kind of the sky and the rope and the sails of the pirate ship. So always attempt to make sure that when you are framing your image, you are framing it in such a way that you have 3 or more levels of depth in your image. The next one is shallow depth of field. This is not something that you always have to have. You don't have to have a super shallow depth of field, but it is appropriate for certain shots based on your story or whatever you're trying to capture in your B-roll. So here's an example from a movie. You have a very shallow depth of field. And so the way that you control this, it's all in the lens of your camera. It's something called f-stop or aperture if you're into photography. Inside of your lens, you have these little windows that open or close, and they control the amount of exposure that is being brought into the camera. But they actually also control the amount of depth of field you are giving, whether it's super shallow or it's really deep. That is controlled by these windows, and you control that manually in any good camera lens. If your aperture or your f-stop is really open, like the example on the left side here, you're going to be letting in a lot of light into your camera sensor. And it's also going to create a very shallow depth, which means anything that's going to be in focus is going to be out of focus in the background. If it's really small and closed, it lets in just a little bit of light, but there is a very deep image, meaning there's not a lot of shallow depth of field. You see this a lot of times, especially with footage that's shot outside, because it's really bright. And so it doesn't want to let a lot of light into the sensor because it's very bright. Otherwise, it'll just be washed out. So it closes, but it also limits your ability to have a very shallow depth of field. If you want to shoot outside and get a shallow depth of field, you need an ND filter on your lens, which is basically like a sunglass over your lens so you can still open up the aperture while making sure you're not letting too much light in by giving it the sunglasses, if you will, the ND filter. A point of focus, and this is a really big thing when it comes to beginners, when it comes to indie filmmakers who are really cutting their teeth. What is in focus? Where is the area that viewers are supposed to be looking at? In this example, it's the eyes. So even the woman's shirt, her neck, things are a little out of focus, but the real focus is the eyes, and they're making sure that it's very sharp and brings your attention to the thing that is the most important for the shot, which is the person's personhood, their eyes. For here, you have like foreground, middle ground, and background, as you can see, and the middle ground is the focus. And as you see, it's not always a person that has to be the point of focus. In this image from the movie Dunkirk, it is kind of the focus of this shot is the papers. It's the notes that are falling from the sky. It's very, very important if you are a beginner to make sure you're getting your focus point correctly. Now, this goes back to depth of field. If something is out of focus, it communicates that it is not important. So when it comes to focus area, it's not only about making sure that you are focused and composed in such a way to bring attention to that spot of your image, but also that it is indeed in focus. A lot of times filmmakers do not have a very important shot in focus. It's a little fuzzy. It's a little out of focus, even though it was meant to be in focus. And a lot of times is because they don't have a better shot to use. This is why it's important to get multiple takes of shots when you're filming so that you're not completely screwing your future self. Rule number 4 is shot size. And this is basically deciding, especially when composing a individual, how you're going to frame them up. There's a variety of different ones here. So you have the extreme close-up, which is kind of like an area of a person's face or an item that is extremely close. It's the very bottom right-hand side image. Then you have the big close-up, which is kind of cutting off the top of the head, cutting around the chin, right? But it's still a close-up. You know, Peter Jackson uses these a lot in the Fellowship and Lord of the Rings movies. You have the standard close-up, which is starting at the top of the head and right below the chin. You want to give some space between the bottom of the frame and the chin to breathe, and you want to make sure it's cutting right at the top of the head. That's a close-up. A medium close-up is kind of like the sternum area to the top of the head and giving a little bit more head space. A medium shot is kind of like belly button, waist area to the top of the head. A medium long shot is sort of kneecaps to the top of the head. A long shot is bottom of the feet to the top of the head. A very long shot, some people refer to this as the wide shot also, where you're showing the environment and the character. And then you have the extremely long shot, which is a lot more of the environment where the character is very small on the screen. So when you're coming up with how you're going to frame something, it's important to think through and write down in your script or your notes what size of the shot you need to capture so you make sure that you get it correctly. The next rule is headroom and lead room. Headroom is basically the top of the frame to the top of the person's head. And lead room, if you imagine your nose is creating a straight line, that person in the image's nose, you want to make sure that there's enough breathing room distance between that line or the start of where that line begins and the edge of the frame that they're pointing at. And in this image, you see Harry Potter's direction from our perspective is facing the right side of the image, which means you want to make sure that his back, where he's pointing away from, is kind of butting up against the left side of the image so that there's plenty of room for his lead room to have breathing room. It feels natural. It's all about balance here. How wide or how close up your shot is determines what the correct version of this is. So how do you find that balance based on what your shot is? Well, there's something called the rule of thirds and the golden ratio. These are basically frame guides. You've probably seen these before, where if you notice, you see blue lines and black lines, and then you see on the blue lines the red intersecting points, the little dots there. On the black lines, you see also the red circles. Those are psychologically what people, when they see an image, these are established rules that people naturally tend to feel the most comfortable with. Like their eyes naturally gravitate towards these areas of your image, which is why most filmmakers will position important areas on these planes. Here's an example. For a very wide shot, your rule of thirds is stretched out a little bit, but basically it is putting his eyes, because they are the most important area of your image when you're framing up a person, putting an eye or putting the eyes very close to the intersecting point of the rule of thirds. I would say the rule of thirds is used the most, but the golden ratio looks like the rule of thirds when you're composing an image. It actually has kind of like this spiral look. It's based on the Fibonacci sequence. Some people argue that it's actually more correct than the rule of thirds. And so some filmmakers will choose to frame up according to the golden ratio. Again, it's just like the rule of thirds when it comes to framing. It's just a little closer to the center. So sometimes you'll see images where it's just off center a little bit. And some people say, based on the Fibonacci sequence, based on the golden ratio, that is more correct of how people perceive and how you should be framing. But a lot of times there's dispute there. Some people use both. Some people just use the rule of thirds, and some people overuse the golden ratio. It's really, when you look at images, it's really your decision to see how someone framed it up and does it feel natural to you. But again, going back to the previous point with headroom and lead room, using these frame guides, it will give you a natural system, a natural guide to keep your image balanced. And so if you were putting someone's eyes on a sector in the rule of thirds, right, then naturally your headroom will probably be in a very comfortable place to keep your image balanced. Pretty much what you're avoiding when it comes to imbalance is someone like, if you take me, for example, if this is my lead room, and if my image, as you can see, if I'm like right here, then that's sort of a problem. There has to be a reason that you want to give someone so little lead room, or if they have headroom, if you're giving them like this much headroom unnecessarily, right? You just want to avoid very basic mistakes like that. And you can accomplish that with the rule of thirds or the golden ratio. The next rule is motivated lighting. This is very important. This is kind of what separates the men from the boys a little bit. In your image, or at least in your scene, in one of your shots, if you're doing a narrative film, if you're doing documentary film or dramatized, really anything, it's really valuable to at some point show where the light source is coming from. In this image, you can see that although they use lights to cast light into the image, in the story, in your shot, it is showing where the light is coming from. So all of the light that's being placed on the character's face is coming from this lamp. It might actually not be, but at least for our image, it appears that it is. This is what is called motivating lighting. Here's another example. It's at night, and you have this really nice backlight of image to kind of show the silhouette and the movements of this character that's on the ground. So in this shot, it is saying essentially that the car headlights are the motivated light that is showing the character. It might actually not be. In fact, most of the times it's not actually the lights in the image that is motivating the light on the character. But what you do is you set up your lights in order to seem as if the light in the image is motivating the light on your characters. You don't have to do this for every shot, but it is beneficial to include it if you can. And if at some point in your scene, if you're putting a scene together, that you establish where the light source is, so that the audience subconsciously kind of falls into belief saying like, oh, this lighting feels natural to me. There's not something that feels off about it because I know where the light source is coming from. Here's another example of two kind of light sources that's being casted on the characters. You have that cold blue light coming in through the window, and you also have that warm tungsten kind of lantern light being casted into the table. And so there's this blending in this image of both cold and warm light, which makes a very interesting interesting look. But this is framed in such a way that we know where the light sources are coming from. The next rule is filling the frame. This can kind of be debated because what does it really mean to fill the frame? I mean, you're going to take a picture or you're going to take video of something. So how do you fill the frame? Well, I took an example of wide shots because if you're talking about close-up shots, it can get a little simple. Like, okay, you just fill the frame with the character and the background and whatever. But with comes to wide shots, one of the biggest, at least to me, one of the biggest areas of failure to fill the frame is too much empty sky or just like filming a wall that is completely bare and just one color and has no texture to it. Basically, you want your image to appear as if it's telling a story, to appear as if it's adding value to your story, right? And so if you look here from Lord of the Rings, you see Minas Tirith in the background. You also see Gandalf riding on the horse towards the city. You see the hill. You see the mountains in the background. You also see the sky is very cloudy and that it appears as if a storm or something is coming through. And really, it's, the forces of Mordor that's leaking over into Gondor. And so when you see this, everything in the image is adding value. You even see the river off to the side a little bit that we know is important for the story later on. Contrasted with this, where the majority of this image, or at least half, is nothing, there's nothing going on in the sky. It is just kind of a color, and it's framed up in such a way that to be on the third, but it's showing so much of the sky, and it adds nothing to a story here. Like, only part of your image is telling the story of what's going on here. And so this is an example of not filling the frame. Make sure that there's something interesting or valuable to the story, or at least just texture or light or something that is going to fill your frame so that your frame is interesting to look at and not boring. So make sure you fill the frame with valuable content. Small lights versus large lights. This is something that's very difficult to understand if you're a beginner, but it becomes very clear when you start actually putting it into practice. So for most people that are experienced in lighting a scene, they probably understand the basic of a 3-point lighting system. You have the key light, the fill light, the backlight. Sometimes the fill light is not a light at all. Sometimes it's just a bounce card or a white sheet, right? To bounce some of the key light back onto the other side of the character's face or the subject's face. But this principle, the key light, is always the brightest and most important light when it comes to setting a scene, because that is the source. If you go back to motivated lighting, well, what are you supposed to be motivating in your image? You're supposed to be motivating primarily the key light. If you're using a key light to illuminate a character in a scene or a person in your shot, you want to make sure that that key light is the primary source of light. So if you're telling a story, you want to motivate where that key light is coming from, even if it is artificial. But when it comes to Hollywood, a lot of times Hollywood will use large lights, and it doesn't necessarily mean the light is big. They do use big RE lights, but it also means they want to make sure that the plane in which light is being casted is not just a small light, but rather a very large canvas, something that's called a scrim. So how they do that is they take a light and they shoot it onto the scrim, and the scrim will reflect light through it and cast it into your image. Why do they do this? Why don't they just set up a small little light that's very bright, because lights are so bright these days, and just throw it at the image? Well, you get a different result. Here's an example that I found of someone doing a test between using a scrim or just using a light without diffusion, basically, without large diffusion. And what you can see in the top image is without diffusion. So as you can see, it creates a lot of very harsh shadows. The smaller the light, the less diffused it is, the more shadows it creates, very harsh shadows, very hard lines. And it could become very harsh. It could be used, like it's a style that you can use for your story, but it's not naturally the most comfortable to look at and not naturally the most flattering. So you want to make sure it's used appropriately. So a lot of times Hollywood just opts for doing this very large diffused light. The larger the light diffusion, so a scrim or a very large, soft box that's put on your light can create this very soft roll into the contrast, roll into the shadows. And so that's very valuable for you to do. If you want to use a scrim and set up, a whole system like this, Hollywood does it for almost every scene they film. And so it's a very valuable tool. If you don't have all of that, you could just get a very large softbox and put that on your key light to get the desired outcome and to not have those extremely harsh cutting shadows. But remember, the general rule is the larger the light, the more appealing, the more soft and more flattering light is going to be casted onto the story subjects, onto the characters, onto the focus area of your shot. The next rule is shoot shadow side. So as you saw before, you have the key light, you have the fill light, you have the camera. Well, naturally, when you're composing, there is normally going to be, unless your key light is right in front of you, contrast across the face of a character, right? So this is the difference between shooting shadow side and shooting key light side or shooting light side. When it comes to cinematic film, you just want to make your image more dynamic. You want to make it look the most attractive. I would say shooting shadow side is kind of the very simplest key turns that you can possibly make in understanding how to make your film or how to make your shots look cinematic. When you shoot shadow side, it naturally gives a element of dynamics, right, in your image. So the general rule here is that if the key light is set up like right here, then I would put my camera here and I would shoot this side of my face while the key light is hitting me on this side of the face. So the contrast that's on this side of the face, as you see here, you're shooting into the shadows, right? You're shooting into the shadows of your image rather than just exposing all of this side of the face and the ear and the hair and everything with the key light just being shot right there. It makes a very big difference when it comes to making your footage look cinematic. Here's an example from The Godfather. As you can see, they shot shadow side. So they're just creating depth even in the person's face by saying the key light's on that side. If we're going to imagine the nose is making a straight line, the character's nose, and we put the key light on one side of it, and we're going to shoot into the shadow side of the characters. This is an example in the movie of Godfather where they actually did not shoot shadow side. And personally, there's a lot of directors that talk about how it's perfectly okay to not shoot shadow side. I understand what they're saying. I personally don't see the point of that unless you're just like on set and you have your motivated lighting. It's all coming through like a specific window, but you realize that the composition of your image looks better if we don't shoot shadow side for the background and such. That might be a case where you're just like, all right, we're not going to shoot shadow side. But for me, is I always default to shooting shadow side unless there's a really good reason not to. Here's an example of even shooting outside. In Indiana Jones, they're just driving in a car and they're driving down the road, and the sun, or at least what is supposed to be the sun, is illuminating their faces, and they're on the side of the car that is shooting shadow side. You can do it with the sun as well. If you're shooting in golden hour or early at dawn where the sun is very close to the earth, it's going to be creating a lot of straight light, which basically means you can shoot shadow side even in direct sunlight if you want to, and use the sun as a very large key light. The next rule is leading lines. So what is leading lines? In an image and in an environment and in everything you set up, there are going to be straight lines of some sort in your image. The general rule is that it's very nice to see leading lines pointing people's eyes to what is important in the image, where they should be looking, because naturally, when we see a new image, when we see a new frame and we start exploring it with our eyes, we kind of find patterns, we kind of find lines, and we follow them. So the point is, where are we following them to? And it really should be the subject. It really should be the most important area of focus in your image. So like here, this guy looking down the road, you have that beautiful leading line of the very long road. A lot of people do these with train tracks as well, or hallways. Even in this image from Denis Villeneuve's Blade Runner, when you look at this image, where do you think the leading lines are? Well, I've found them for you. You have her finger actually is a leading line. You have the railing, you have the side railing, the railing above him. All of these areas are leading lines that's kind of pointing you towards the direction of the image you're supposed to be looking, which is him. The next rule is catch lights. And so what is catch lights? It is basically the life of the character, the life of the person. So here's an example. It's the little dots. I actually have them right now. It's the little dots of light in people's eyes. It gives the person humanity. Without catch lights, psychologically, people are inclined to think that person's dead, right? Because it's like the soul. It's the life force of the human. It's the humanity. And so naturally, like when you're lighting a scene, if you're using a key light, a lot of times the character's eyes are just going to naturally pick up the key light. So it's not always something you have to pay close attention to because you'll probably get them without even trying. But here's an example of being very intentional with catch lights from the Fellowship of the Ring and the character Galadriel. The books describe Galadriel as if she has like the stars in her eyes, right? Because she's supposed to be this elf of immense beauty. And so what Peter Jackson actually did is that they had a light that had a bunch of different small lights in it, and they casted it into the image so that her eyes would pick up on this dance of light, right? This multiple sources of light. And so you have to look very closely. But when they're doing these close-ups of Galadriel and you pick up on the catch lights, you're seeing sort of what the books describe as if there's stars in her eyes. It's not just one catch light, but rather a dance of an abundant, a starry night, right, of catch lights. The next rule is shooting coverage. This is basically when you're going to shoot a scene, especially for narrative storytelling, it's making sure all your ducks are in the row for editing, all right? This also makes sure that you get what you need, and so that as you're cutting between different shot types, you have the freedom and you have the ability to edit to motivate emotion rather than just editing together kind of a boring two-person conversation. So shooting coverage basically refers to making sure you're getting all your shots. A lot of times shooting coverage, most of the time, especially in Hollywood or production, means starting wide and working in. Okay, so starting wide and working in. So if your scene calls for a long shot between two characters and it's going to be a two shot, so two people are going to be in the image, you will start there, like this example, and then you will move into the over the shoulder kind of medium close up shots, right? Where you see in the center of this example, they have two over the shoulders of both characters and they're kind of medium close-ups, so like right below the breast area to the top of the head. Then you have the close-ups, so right below the chin to the top of the head for each character. This is shooting coverage. Some people do this with one camera and they just do it one at a time. Some people, like Ridley Scott, has talked about how they will set up a scene and light a scene in order to be able to shoot coverage all at the same time. That's very difficult to do, but if you can pull it off, go for it. It definitely makes time go a lot faster. The next rule is color and exposure difference. So let's start with exposure. Basically, in an image, you want to make sure that your story subject, you want to make sure that your character subject, the image subject, is either brighter or darker than the background. So when you are indoors, the majority of time, what looks natural to people is making sure that your subject is brighter than your background. So as you can see here, this woman, her face, her hair, her skin, her eyes, everything is exposed brighter than the background that she's on. If you are very white skinned, like she is, or even like I am, and you put them up against a white wall and you just throw a light up, well, you're casting light onto the wall and their skin, and all of a sudden everything's exposed very similarly, and it just creates this really flat, amateur looking image. You do not want to do that. You want to make your image dynamic, which basically means making sure that there feels like there's a difference here, there's depth here, there's actually focus here, and There is exposure difference here. Are you starting to see how all of the rules I talked about before all kind of blend together into specific rules for each other? Here's an example of shooting outside in the desert with Timothy Chalamet during the Dune movie. He's out in the desert. Naturally, when you're out in the desert and you're shooting landscapes, the environment is going to be brighter than you are, which is okay. You're not inside. That's how people see. Like naturally, when they're out in a bright environment, a person they're talking to is darker than they are, which means you want to make sure that the background is slightly brighter than you. So you stand out, right? But you also want to make sure you are exposed well. So shooting outside can kind of be the opposite of what it's like to shoot inside. But the general rule is make sure there is exposure difference between your foreground, your subject, what you're focused on, and the background, which is what you're not focused on, which is just the rest of the frame. There's also something called color difference. So adding into the exposure difference, you can also do color difference between foreground or background. In this example, they actually chose to do, the foreground is Ana de Armas. This is the new ballerina movie. I pulled this from the trailer. She's in the foreground, and then the second level, right, is the green side of the wall. And they chose to illuminate this kind of this greenish teal color. And then it goes deeper into this room or this cave or whatever that it is you'd consider this to be. And there's this warm glow that's shooting up out of it. So there's like 3 levels of layers here, while there's also color difference between the 3 of them, because she kind of has more white but slightly warmish glow with this top down kind of very white bluish light. And then there's like a darker greenish light behind her with a very bright orange light behind her. Then all of these are color differences from each other. Also from Ballerina, here's another example of color difference. The light that is illuminating their skin is probably like a fluorescent light, something that's a bit warmer, something that's a bit more color temperature of sky, or maybe a fluorescent light. It's just basically one to accent skin tones very nicely. And they're wearing red suits, right? Not black suits, but rather red suits. It's a very specific choice. And how they lit it is they have this really blue light that's just being thrown into the room and into the background as their backlight. So what it does is it creates color difference and color separation from the background with not only how they're lighting, but also the color in which they're wearing and what color their light is in the background. So make sure you're always paying attention to creating exposure difference between your foreground and background. And if you can pull it off, also do color difference between your foreground and background. The color difference really does start to stylize your film, which some filmmakers really love that. Some filmmakers choose not to stylize with colors. They want their colors to look very natural. That's fine. You have to make your choice. But these are tools that can really help in that process. Avoid over and under exposure. This is getting a bit technical, and so I'm sure a lot of people know about this. There's something called a waveform monitor. Basically, it looks like this. So 0% at the very bottom is the darks. It's the blacks in the image. 100% is the highlights. It's the whites in the image. If you go out of bounds, be below 0% or over 100%, you are peaking out at the highest highlight or the lowest dark that your sensor can see, which basically means when you go to correct or color grade your footage, if you had something that was below 0%, you can't save it. It's just going to be black. It was captured as black. There's no information there. It's the same with the whites. A lot of times people get in trouble when they're shooting outside and they hit the sky. A lot of times the sky is overexposed and it's over 100%. So if there's any blue in that sky, if they overexposed it, they're not going to see any of that blue. It's just going to be white and white and white. Like that, that's all that's going to happen. And the way to read a waveform monitor is it basically reads it the same as your image. So if you see from left to right of your image, it is reading the amount of light exposure it's giving you. So as you see here, from the left side to the right side, if you start on the left, you see the whites are really peeking out on this image. It's because that white wall and her white shirt that's right behind here, it is seeing that very bright white, and it's kind of touching 100, which means it's about to be overexposed. And then you get to like her skin tone. She has a darker skin tone. It drops down into like 25, 40%, right? And it fluctuates. And then when you get past her skin tone, you're back into the white wall and the furniture and her sleeve, and it shoots back up close to between 90 and 100% there. This is an example of a waveform looking at your image. Now, in digital, there is new technology that allows you to be able to save yourself from over or under exposure, or at least make it easier to save yourself, and that is log footage. For Sony, you have S-Log. For Canon, it is C-Log, and it's basically what it is it flattens your image, so it creates more dynamic range. And dynamic range basically means how far into the amount of exposure can your sensors still see. So it's not losing the shadows or the highlights. And when you color grade it, when you bring up the contrast and the saturation, you can control how much of it you want to see. And you're basically not losing parts of your image to highlights or shadows. If you shoot log footage, you save yourself the potential loss of shadows and highlights. And when you see it on a waveform monitor, when you're on set, you see that log footage kind of compresses your waveform monitor where it's not like all the way up to 100 or all the way down to 0. It kind of crunches it. And it can get very technical as to exactly where on the waveform monitor you should have your log footage sitting. And there's a bunch of rules, especially even when in color grading using LUTs. Like, log footage can be a little bit of a task for beginners, but it is a very useful tool when it comes to protecting your image in the final color grade. So I would say avoid, a big rule, even if you don't use log footage, try your best to have a waveform monitor that's connected to your camera so that you can see what your camera sees and that you are not peeking out highlights or dropping below 0. I believe cameras also have internal options for this as well. So you don't have to have a monitor, but it definitely makes things a bit easier. And this leads me to the next rule, which is have plenty of light and dimmers on set or on a shoot, especially for documentary filmmaking, especially for narrative short film or indie film making. You want to have plenty of lights. And the reason why is you don't want your camera to do all the work. If you all are familiar with, digital cameras, something called ISO, or, in Sony cameras for a long time, it was called gain. It's basically, there's like a native place where the sensor is sensitive to light, okay? If you push past that point, it all of a sudden lets more light in, but it distorts your image. And how does it distort your image? Well, basically, as you see from the example here, in video and photography, it will cause this grain, this distortion. It's because your sensor is letting in a lot of light and it doesn't know how to fully control it without causing that distortion. If you're trying to shoot in an environment and you make your camera do all the work, and so you only have a few small lights, and so you're like, well, I'll just adjust my camera exposure to see more of the image, right? Well, what that's doing, it's adjusting the ISO. It's adjusting the gain of your camera. And if you're causing it to work too hard to bring in too much light, then you're going to have a problem with your image. So the better alternative is to basically set your camera at the native, or at least like with DSLRs or something, as low as it can go in a comfortable area, probably around 400 to 800, and don't go higher than that. And make sure you have plenty of lights to throw a lot of light into your image on set physically there, so your camera doesn't have to do all the work to compensate for the lack of light. Now, I know new cameras are coming out, especially with Sony and Blackmagic, that has crazy good ISO settings that are native, that are way up in the 3 to 4,000 range, right? It's crazy what native ISO is doing, but it is still a very good practice to make sure you have plenty of lights. And I also said dimmers, and the reason for that is because if you're shooting an interview, or you have an artificial light, or you want to have a light that you're going to motivate from, maybe a lamp. Well, sometimes if you just flick that lamp on, it's putting off too much light. Actually, you want to have control of what that looks like, and you need to dim that lamp down. And the only way to do that is to have a dimmer. You want to make sure that we can see light coming off of the lamp, but we don't want it to have that much light coming off the lamp. Because when it comes down to it, like cinematic film is ultimately light, light and colors. That's kind of it. I've given you so many rules, and I have a couple more to share with you that are super valuable. But when it comes down to it, film is, and making things look cinematic is kind of just light. It's kind of just your image is just going to be light and colors. And so you want to make sure that light is prioritized in your process. Don't go to set. If you don't have a single light with you, you probably made a mistake. If you're going to shoot something and you don't have a light, you've probably made a big mistake. 180-degree rule. You've probably heard of this one, but this is a very common rule when shooting a scene. So if you imagine two characters that are like standing next to each other or sitting next to each other, if you kind of create a line with them, well, you will basically want to shoot on that side. Like you pick a side of the line that you want to shoot on, and you stay on that side of the line. Okay. The reason for that is because it feels natural for the viewer to observe from a specific point, right? So if you jump to the other side of the line, all of a sudden your characters were on one side of the frame and the other side of the frame, and now they flip-flopped if you switch sides. And you don't want to do that because it can feel jarring. So the general practice is to pick a side, create a line with your characters, and shoot on that side and stay on that side. You can shoot multiple angles from that side, but don't cross over. There are examples that show the camera crossing over into the other side, and then they start shooting from that side. If you show the transition to the other side, that's fine with me. I don't have a problem with that. I think that's actually kind of interesting. But don't just hard cut from one side of the image to the other side. It keeps all the characters in place and feels like you are observing as a third party this conversation between characters from a very natural position. This is an example of what it looks like. So, you got Paul Atreides and his father Leto. If you imagine they create a line, then you have the wide shot that's looking towards them. And then when you do the close-ups, the over the shoulders, you are still staying on that side of the line. You are budging up against the line to get these over the shoulders, but you are not crossing the line. And you still have, Paul on the left side of the image, and you have his father on the right side of the image. And that is still valuable for both the wide shot and the close-ups over the shoulders. The next rule is movement. I saw this meme, I guess, or kind of descriptor meme that was very funny to me. It says camera movement guide. It shows you all the different movements and the names. And then it says client camera movement guide. And all of them are just called pan. I thought that was funny. It made me chuckle because when you are working with someone who doesn't know what camera movements are called, everything's a pan. Everything. I mean, it doesn't matter what you do. It's like pan up. That's not how a pan works. So let's go through these real quickly. These are the basic camera movements when it comes to storytelling. And these are kind of, on a device that is moving your camera for you. The only one that's not included here is handheld, which is becoming more popular, especially with Steadicam and, the Ronin Steadicams. And so handheld is definitely an option, but these are the traditional movements of camera. You have dolly, which is on a track that dollies forward. So it sees a straight dolly forward. You have boom, which is a straight boom up and down, right? Where your camera stays horizontal, but you're booming it up, right? You have truck, which is like a dolly, except it's side to side. Okay. So dolly is forward and back, and truck is side to side. It's on wheels. You have pan, which is the camera stays still. It's on a tripod, but the head of the tripod is panning left and right. That is the pan. Clients think that's everything, but that's the only thing the pan is. A tilt is the same thing as a pan, except from side to side, it's up and down, right? And then you have a roll, which is the camera rolling. Combine these together, you can pan and tilt at the same time. You can boom and tilt at the same time. You can even pan and dolly at the same time. Like there's a lot of options when it comes to movement in cinematography. And when you're filming something, it's always valuable to have movement, at least pretty consistently, but it should be motivated movement. Here's a tip. Most of the time when it comes to filmmaking and telling a narrative story, the camera moves with the characters. Okay, so the camera moves with the characters. If the characters is standing still, the camera should be standing there with them. If the character is walking, the camera should be moving with them, right, in that direction. That's a general tip. If you're like not sure, you're like, the action for my character is this, how am I going to film this? Well, consider some movement. All right, what is the character doing? How do you want to emulate and move with that character through that scene using these basic film movements? I only have 2 more rules for you, and this next one is symmetry. Again, you're not always going to have symmetry with your shots, but it's very valuable when you occasionally implement it. So if you watch Wes Anderson films, everything he does is about symmetry. This is an example from one of his movies. Is you take an image and you like, hey, where's the center point here? How can I create a line down the center of my image and try to emulate to where both sides of the frame, if I cut the frame in half, are mirroring each other, or at least a version of mirroring each other that feels right. You could do this with hallways. Doors are really, really easy to do this with. If you put the door in the center of the frame, well, naturally the door frame creates a mirrored opportunity for you. And the idea of symmetry is just that the image is balanced from on the left side and the right side in either mirroring each other or not mirroring each other, but having a balance of weight in your image. There's a lot of videos online that explains Wes Anderson's symmetry. You should definitely check it out. Frame within the frame. And so, as you know, a camera shot is a frame. It's a window, right? So the idea is, how do you make it more interesting? How do you also get kind of like those layers? If you go all the way back to the beginning, the image depth, 3 or more layers. How do you use frames and layers to bring focus to characters, to create depth? Well, I'm going to show you some examples. In The Batman, directed by Matt Reeves, the cinematographer was Greg Fraser. He's like my favorite cinematographer. At the very beginning of the film, there was this shot that I thought is just stuck with me. And it was looking through the roof and seeing this guy watching TV in his living room. And it's a very small sliver of the image that is the focus point of your shot, and the rest of the thing is just texture and light. But this is an example of a frame within a frame. It's a very small sliver of a frame that is within your frame, that is like the content that is important is here, right, in this image. From The Batman, also you have this. It's like you have little windows of light silhouetting, and in this particular window, it's important. It's the most important window because it has Batman and Catwoman in it together. And so this is like a frame within your image frame. It's framing up the subjects, right? So that people also know where to look. I also saw this. This is a very interesting use of a frame within a frame. They're using, I guess, a seduction scene, and this woman is using her leg to frame up the character that we're focused on, which is the man. I haven't seen this movie. I don't know what it's from, but basically they're building a frame within a frame using a woman's leg, and that's a very interesting choice as well. I hope this was extremely valuable. I know it took a while. I know it took time to go through all of this, but if you really understand and learn how to implement all of these rules on some level of or another, or a combination of these rules together into an image, your footage will start to look cinematic very quickly. And if you haven't heard of, honestly, this incredible game-changing technology that just came out that very well might change the landscape of cinematography and filmmaking altogether, check out this video I did reacting to it and go have your mind blown, because it's going to change everything.